So we just talked about the controls over ecosystem processes, and we really focused on the independent controls over ecosystem processes, state factors. Now what we want to cover are the interactive controls over ecosystem processes, and this is one of the main developments of state factor theory, are concepts of what structures ecosystems. Now in the book the authors state that interactive controls are factors, just like state factors, but they're factors that operate at the ecosystem scale and both control and respond to ecosystem characteristics. So they both control it and they respond to ecosystem characteristics. They're under some control of the properties that we want to study in ecosystems. So for example, we can think about nutrient cycling in ecosystems, and one of the things that's really important about nutrient cycling, what determines the nutrient cycle, is how much fixation of atmospheric N2 there is. And a lot of that happens inside the nodules of plants. So plants have little factories that fix nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, into more usable forms, inorganic and then organic forms. And that happens here. Now the amount of nitrogen fixation that occurs, the amount of nitrogen cycling that occurs in a place, is going to be dependent on what organisms you have there and their activity. That's going to be determined by all the state factors, but a whole bunch of other things that are going on. Something like nitrogen fixation is impacted by state factors, but it's not totally controlled by the state factors alone, and it's somewhere in the middle. And this is one of the interactive controls over something like nitrogen cycling and a lot of the other ecosystem processes. Disturbance is another thing. Disturbance is definitely influenced by state factors and independent controls. Here we see a fire going through the landscape, and whether a fire happens or not, its intensity, its severity, the frequency that it happens, all of those things about disturbance applied here to fire depends on the state factors, but it depends on a whole host of other things too that are partially under control of the organisms in there and the other processes that are going on. It's not just state factors. So when we think about interactive factors, what the authors say is that interactive controls are factors that operate at the ecosystem scale and both control and respond to ecosystem characteristics. It's that idea of being somewhere in the middle of a state factor and the process that you want to study. In addition, it affects ecosystems, but it's within the control of local organisms. State factors, for all intents and purposes, are not within the control of local organisms. Interactive factors are. So here we have that original diagram abstracted from the book. This is Terry's approach to really developing the state factor approach for ecosystems. And in addition to having the state factors there, so recognizing climate, topography, parent material, and potential biota, and then the time that, since succession has been working in ecosystem development, has been having, and there's the role of humans too that we'll talk about next. All of these are state factors. They're external to the ecosystem for all intents and purposes. On the inside, we have our ecosystem processes that are happening, and these are also under control of different things that are impacted by state factors, but also impacted by the ecosystem processes themselves. They're within the feedbacks of the ecosystem. And the four that they highlight here are microenvironment. So just like we talk about climate, for example, being external, by the time climate starts to work its way down to individual plants, plants affect their microenvironment, the environment around them, how hot it is, how cold it is, the humidity. All of that is under some control of the plant. Another interactive factor, interactive control, is the disturbance regime. Functional types is a different way to think about potential biota. So the potential biota are all the species that could be there, and then which ones actually are there, they've characterized it as being the functional types of plants. What types of plants are they, and what functions do they hold? And lastly, we have resources. So in their approach, they didn't have resources as a state factor, but definitely as an interactive control, resources are there. And it's these four factors that are under partial control of the vegetation of the entire biota of the ecosystem, and are under some control, but also under control of the state factors, somewhere in the middle. So we can't understand how an ecosystem works simply by understanding the state factors. We also have to take into account some of the other interactive controls too, to really understand how that ecosystem is functioning at a particular point in time. Now, if I adapt kind of the approach that I was using to develop this just a little bit, we have our 5 state factors on the outside, and on the inside, more or less, I think what they had works pretty well. If this represents our ecosystem processes, we still have our microclimate, which is a trickle down of climate. Still, the disturbance regime is important too. And instead of saying functional types, I'll say species composition is being important. And as we'll go through, categorizing different species into types isn't something that even the authors really do much more. And then lastly, we have resources. So those are more or less all the same. And it's just taking what they had said and more or less applying it here. So in the end, if we want to understand how an ecosystem is functioning, we have to think about the state factors, those factors that function relatively independently of what's going on within the ecosystem boundary that we delineate. But then we also have to think about interactive controls. We have state factors, interactive controls, those factors that are under partial control of the biota of an ecosystem, but are also impacted by state factors. They're somewhere in the middle. So at this point, what I would say is that it's really important to understand the state factors and understand that resources are also independent state factors. And as far as interactive controls are concerned, the 4 interactive controls that the authors offer are really important ones to know too. And I would make sure that you know what those 4 are. My approach to interactive controls really isn't that important, and I wouldn't memorize it, but just make sure you know what the book has to say and how the authors think about both state factors and interactive controls.